When they come to my office, it's obvious that they're in trouble, and people come to me when they're in trouble, not because I'm so sensitive, smart, and aware of their feelings. Steele is an investigator and security consultant in St. Louis, Missouri, often referred to as a private investigator. Whether it's your wife, husband, child, or enemy, I'll do whatever is legal, although sometimes it's a fine line. I'll help you learn about their past, if there's anything you can use to control them, but if it's physical revenge you want, then find someone else. I sat up and waited for one of them to speak. Mr. Steele asked me. I nodded and he continued, I'm Jason Voss, this is my wife Susan, I need your help. He was 6 feet 1 inch, muscular, probably out of the gym, and had an air of superiority that only big money can bring. She had the kind of looks that would make men run into road signs or wreck their cars because they'd be staring at her instead of where they were going or what they were doing. If I'm being brutally honest, Mrs. Worth can't be more than 35 years old, about my age. Now, Susan would make Helen of Troy look like an ugly cousin who also had a muscular body, but she looked like she played tennis or golf or something, and Susan preferred a toned body to a model on the runway to going to the gym every day. I watched as she sat down and crossed her legs. I sighed and sat back in my chair and focused on business. I told myself, and I responded to myself, you're kidding. I continued to discuss it with myself. The last thing the devil said before I pushed him out of my mind was that my dark hair and gray eyes were exactly what she needed to impress me. Satan, I know a little bit about your background, and I think you're exactly the kind of man I need, for what it's worth. I pondered for a moment and nodded. I guess my background is that Matthew Steele used to be the rising star of the St. Louis Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, and I was sure I could have been a captain by the time I was 35, which was 5 years ago. My partner suggested I go home. You're jumping in and out of your car, we might as well put up a neon sign that says police stakeout, go home. I walked to the corner about 200 feet away and called the police department and requested a patrol car to come pick me up and take me home. The 2 patrolmen made fun of me the whole way. Looking back at the scene, it was a good thing they were with me. The 2 patrolmen followed me from the hallway to the bedroom. There was no mistaking the sounds coming from the hallway. Someone or more was having sex. I walked towards the bedroom door. I knew what I would see before I got there, and I was right. My wife Johanna was having sex with a man. The same question has been asked thousands of times. I've seen a lot of domestic disputes, and even though I was pissed off, I wanted to get that man out of my house. I knew, if I started to hit that man, I probably wouldn't stop. That would put me in danger. When I saw him standing up naked, I was so surprised I lost my mind, and I wouldn't have attacked him if he hadn't gone for the gun on the nightstand next to the bed. I pulled away from him before he could get the gun and slapped him so hard I bet his dad's head hurt like hell. He fell on the bed and I straddled him and started pounding him. I swear I didn't intend to hit my wife. I don't hit women, but she jumped between Harper and me, and I don't know if she was trying to protect Harper or try to stop me. From going to jail. Joanna got hit with a roundhouse punch from me and the teapot fell off the bed. Well, the patrolman who brought me home heard me yelling and ran down the hall to my bedroom, and before I could be convicted of manslaughter or murder, they took me away from him, and no one, not even my wife, who works for the local school board, and especially not Captain Harper, who didn't want the story to be to the public, and I complained that it wasn't right or fair for me to lose my job while Harper got away with it. There was a stern letter of reprimand in his file, and I guess it was Major Taylor, the scout leader, who told me that Harper was going to be demoted to lieutenant because of that letter and the reasons behind it. And I said, where's his punishment and what did he lose? I lost my wife and my job, and I lost my way of life, and it was a bad outcome. And Taylor said, but his family had too much political power. The upper echelons of the bureau couldn't do more, and I know that you had been a competent, even brilliant detective, and I understand why you left the department. You were the ideal candidate for the position. And when he said my ex-wife's name, I thought I was right. I didn't like the son of a bitch. What's your job, Mr. Worth? My wife Worth was squirming in his chair, obviously ashamed and angry. Susan retorted, my friend is a talented actor. He's had a few small roles and performed at the Moon Opera House. I'm not interested in listening to the two of you attacking each other. Like I said, Susan is having an affair with our pool boy. Apparently the teenager didn't like the repercussions of his brief encounter with my wife, and he threatened me. Jason actually said that Stanley was blackmailing him. Susan smiled slightly, which seemed sexy to me at least. And Stanley, I mean, I told my husband that he had the DVD of Stanley and I together, and he said he would make sure that it would be made public, and that all of our friends, family members, and Jason's business associates would receive a copy of the DVD that Jason did not pay him $100 for, and he said, I want you to find him and convince him to let me go and give you the DVD and any copies he makes. That's why I came to see you. I've heard you're very discreet. I asked who introduced you to me. Major Taylor. We met at various police socials. I said I hadn't made up my mind yet. Leave your phone number and I'll call you back in the morning with my answer. You may know there are other private detectives. Yes, there are, Mr. Worth. Feel free to contact any of them, but if you want me, you'll have to wait until tomorrow morning to see if I'm available. Besides, money isn't everything, I lied. Money is everything, well, almost everything. I can call you tomorrow if you want. If not, I can call you tomorrow. I think I'm going to enjoy working with you, Mr. Steele, and I bet you'll be happier than poor Stanley. Hopefully not for the same reason. I don't know what's wrong with him. The Major admits he's a bit of a mystery. He asked me if I could recommend any pies, and I told him I'd recommend either you or Rowley Chambers. Matt, I'm fine, Major. The Bureau pitched me nearly 2 years, and I made lemonade with all those lemons, and I like my life, and I work when I want to, and for who I want to, and the only reason I've got an office is that I get to meet with my clients. Wouldn't having a nice office wow your clients? It would make more people think I'm desperate because of where I live. My attorney Jeb Smith is a former college friend of mine. He's awesome. He's as mean as a great white in a sea of small sharks. Jeb is so good, as soon as he starts to swim the other sharks run away. It's good to have friends. It's even better to have friends that can help you make a lot of money. I mean, you did hit your supervisor for whatever reason. This is considered insubordination. But I inquired about it, but the department objected to the media focus on it. It's bad enough that a supervisor beats his subordinate's wife, but for the supervisor to get just a slap on the wrist and the husband to be fired, that's hard to accept in the public, much less the average police officer. And when Jeb told me when and where the meeting was going to take place, I said, Judas is a perfect name for a lawyer. Then I realized who I was talking to, and I apologized and said I didn't mean you. Jeb laughed and opened another glass of wine. Call me what you will, but pay me 30 silver pieces. He read the request for the meeting again. We will meet Dobson, but that's what I want you to do. We went into Dobson's office and were taken to the spacious conference room. The secretary brought us coffee. They were all lawyers and Jeb was outnumbered by one, but I was confident about them. My sharks are confident, Mr. Steele. I'm Judy Dobson. He sat across the table and spoke. It was all I could do to keep from laughing when I heard his name. Mr. Smith must have told you that you have no chance of winning the case. Dobson's face turned red, and the young female attorney sitting on his side of the table tried to keep from laughing. Yes, he laughed, but I'll seek a trial by jury and take my chances in court. The jury will see what I've brought in. They'll criticize the Harper Department and the city of St. Louis. It's your choice, Dobson. Come on, Jeb, let's go to lunch so you can add to your expense account. I stood up and headed for the door. Jeb Ross shrugged his shoulders at Dobson, and followed me. PM. We'll get the check first thing in the morning, Matt, and if you take good care of yourself, there's a good chance you won't have to work for 3 or 4 years. I believe I've picked up the phone and called Mr. WTH, Mr. Worth, and I've decided to have a further in-depth conversation about your case, and I'll be at your house tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to gather further information, and possibly a deposit. 00 hung up on time. You can't even see his home from the road. His home is like a golf course with lots of trees, not just a place to build a house. The grass grows in abundance. There are no barren areas, and it's highly accurate. I'm driving my old pickup truck and I see that the right rear fender is covered in Bondo adhesive used for body filler. I'm fixing the rusted areas. My truck has 3 different paint colors and Bondo doesn't count, because a door and a front fender came from different trucks. When I stopped in front of Worth's house, he gave me a look of disgust and a grimace. Seriously, Mr. Steele, did you have to go looking for my truck? It was my work truck, my only work truck, and I had to close the driver's door twice to lock it. He wore a dark blue suit and undershirt with light-colored pinstripes and a blue shirt with a small diamond pattern on a blue background, which had an open collar, and which I believe was Christian Dior. Tall white columns supported a balcony on the 2nd floor, and I guessed he liked to stand on the balcony and watch the peasants laboring in it. The place he led us into reminded me of a sitting room, as I believe the upper class and landed gentry called it. From here you could see the long, manicured lawn and the swimming pool at the back of the property. Most of the furniture was rotting, including the glass-topped table. I noticed all the plants placed in the room and thought to myself that it was a jungle. She was dressed more modestly this time, but there was no denying that she was a very sexy lady. My reaction was quick. I'm an investigator by profession, so I'm quick to catch things like this. I pulled my hand out of hers and looked around the room. A Susan Worth painting hung on one wall with a wood-burning fireplace. I knew very little about art, but I knew what I liked, and I liked this painting very much. As I glanced at the painting, she approached me and she screwed the artist. He spoke with more than a hint of contempt and hatred in his voice, and then the dumbass wanted full payment. She seemed to enjoy tormenting me by hammering away at the help. She gave me a sexy smile as if to say, you too might be one of the lucky ones. Yeah, I gotta watch out for this one. Muscular with a six-pack, and that picture was taken by a security company that watches our house when we're away for long periods of time. It also said where he went to college, if he graduated, and what he was interested in, besides Susan Worth. I stared at Worth with an unspoken question in my mind, the part about his likes and dislikes coming from his cover letter, and he turned to his wife. I didn't know Sten very well and looked at her husband as she explained, "We never talked much. How did Moore talk to you about money?" I shook my head and answered my own stupid question. Worth replied, "I got this delivery at the office, handed me a folded piece of paper, a letter, actually a note, supposedly from Stanley Moore. A 1-hour DVD of Susan and Stanley together. He was asking for $100. The note said that he had a 2-hour DVD of Susan and Stanley having sex and that he was asking for $100,000 for the DVD or a promise to send the DVD to friends, relatives, and business associates for the same price. The note also said that he would contact them within a few days to arrange for the money to be wired and that upon receipt of the money, he would send out the DVDs." The look on his face was interesting. He was both proud that he had that much money and frustrated that his wife was talking about it. "Yes, Mr. Steele, I have the money and need to go to the bank to get cash, but I have the money. Stanley Moore is the one who requested the payment, and this note was printed out on a computer or word processor, and isn't really a personal signature, and anyone could have used Stanley's name, so that's how many employees this place has always had, and why it's only the people who live here, and there are 4 of them." And when I raised my eyebrows, Worth paused for a second, and then went on, "Raising your eyebrows is a great communication technique. If you can do it." His wife Emily was the cook and housekeeper. Virus told me Ralph was the driver who also looked after the vehicles, and Jacqueline helped Emily with the housekeeping. "If you spent more time with me, he wouldn't be able to come now, would he, Jason? If I spent more time with you than in the office, you'd have to work to maintain your desired lifestyle." Susan Voss responds. Jason Voss seems to be in a rut. I thought if he didn't make a lot of money Susan would leave him, but his frequent absences have given her the chance to get caught in the middle of other men. Opportunity to be caught in the middle of other men. Okay, you need to send me pictures and information on each of your men. I'll spend some time checking out your house. We'll ask them some questions. You can tell them I'm a security consultant, and I think you've agreed to take my case, despite your misgivings about our lifestyle. My goal is to stop Stanley Moore, or anyone who tries to extort money out of you. And what about this Danby Summers guy? Where can I find him? Susan said we're having a little get-together tonight, and Danby's going to be here, so won't you join us? Won't you come along? Will you spend the night here?" Mrs. Worth asked, with a predatory look and tone in her eyes which might have been of great interest. Skeptical, I replied that I wouldn't spend the night here until I had to. "I think I have a clean pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and the look on Mr. Worth's face is priceless, sir, and I promise to keep my ACT organized." After talking to another former St. Louis police detective, Raleigh Chambers, who had shot a couple of times with his 9mm pistol and then switched to a Glock 4 or 5mm pistol on the advice of Jacob Tully, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant and another former police officer. Tully was instrumental in my decision to switch to a Glock. I had just become a detective and was confident with my gold shield in hand. The first time I fired, the recoil pushed the pistol back into my face, cutting my right eye and causing 3 stitches. Susan spoke and looked straight at me, a smile on her face and an expression in her eyes, and I wasn't sure if she was talking about my gun. I wasn't sure if she was talking about the gun. I was sure, "Mrs. Voss, I don't want to burden you with more than you can handle," I responded, and the look on her face indicated that it had discouraged her somewhat. Mrs. Voss was furious that I wasn't impressed by her charms and the way I spoke to her. She said angrily, "Mr. Steele, you're a cold man." "Yes, that's me, and I answered you with cold steel." "Stealing, Susan, you've got to be honest with me. I can attack my target and I will shoot if I have to, but Mr. Worth, let's get this straight. I am not an assassin and I don't hire people to kill. If that's what you want, you have the wrong man." "No, I understand." He paused for a few seconds. "Mr. Steele, what is your fee?" Mrs. Worth replied, "I'm sorry to leave, but I have a tennis lesson and Sam will be annoyed if I'm late." She approached Mr. Worth and kissed him. "I should have been home at the normal time. Dear, I'm not leaving unless Sam keeps pestering me." As she darted out of the room I asked her if she had any other men to play with, and I guessed that Samantha Dooley was her tennis instructor, and if it was a man I'd have to keep an eye on him. But Jason Worth is very rich, and I don't like him at all, so I upped the ante. "Isn't that a little high, if you want your problems solved?" But he seemed to deflate like a balloon with a hole in it, and he shook his head and replied, "Have you seen her? I know she married me because of money, and until recently I could stand it." I nodded and he poured another glass. "The thing is, if I didn't love her, I had become very fond of her, and that was the main reason I tolerated her behavior." I took a large drink of whiskey and looked him straight in the eye. "WTH, mister, if nothing else, you don't have to worry about me being around Susan. I'm going to your little party tonight to see what's going on with Summers, and I'm going to Moore's address now to see what I can find out, and if one of them sends a letter, with a DVD, I'll bring it over, and we'll get it done quickly, and if you can't get it done quickly, what's going to happen next? I realized that my animosity towards this man had diminished, and I felt sorry for him. Stanley Moore was living in a basement apartment in a refurbished factory on the nearest west side of St. Louis. She said he was going to see his sister and would be back tomorrow. Thank you, ma'am. I gave her my card. Please call me when he gets home, if you notice. I have a job for him. Is that why you wanted to see him? She asked if this was some sort of interview. Yes, ma'am, I'd like to get to know him better, you know his personality and other traits. Stanley's a nice young man, always courteous and helpful to me. Does he live here alone? At least he used to come to him until those two thugs came for him, after which he went away immediately, and I haven't seen him since. I shook my head and said that it would be humorous if this guy helped her in the door after clapping. The guy was a piece of shit. I hoped that I would run into him when I was looking for Stanley. Maybe I had to prove to him that manners can be taught and learned. Stanley calls him RJ, but I've never heard of him. He's about your height, with dark hair combed straight back. I'm sure he's cut from a mold. Stanley was fired. Stanley, a young man, had little chance against that woman's WS. Of course, as soon as that woman came here, her husband found out, and I believe the husband's worth represented Ed. Stanley was blacked out, so he had a hard time finding a job. Have you seen her? Oh yes, she used to ring the doorbell and walk up to Stanley's apartment as if she owned the house. I turned around and left the building and drove back to Voss's house. It was time to take on the role of security consultant and talk to the rest of the staff. Sammy would let me in and show me the living room. Mr. Voss had to go for a while. If you need anything, just press a button and Millie or Jacqueline will appear. Samuel nodded and walked out of the room. In the center of the table sat a number of folders. I sat down and noticed that there was a button to summon an aide. This must be nice. I started to read through the staff information folder. Samuel and Millie Ripley were a married couple. They were both about 57 years old and had worked for Jason Worth for over 20 years. Jacqueline was their niece and was 21 years old. Ralph James is the chauffeur, also known as the driver or something. He's only worked for the Worths for 2 years. As I flipped through the binder, something was haunting me. I walked to the kitchen where Millie and Jacqueline were preparing lunch and Samuel was sitting at the dining room table reading a book. I checked the kitchen door and windows and all in all got in the way of Millie and Jacqueline. I had to say sorry or apologize for the third time. Samuel grinned and suggested that we go outside for a cup of coffee or at least wait until the girls were done making lunch. Who the hell are you, anyway? Mr. Steele, what are you doing here? Samuel asked, not angry, just curious. Why do you think I'm not a security consultant? Jacqueline saw the letter while cleaning the living room. Samuel smiled and shook his head. I didn't think this young man was so smart to do something like this. I don't think I'm the only one who would use this trick. Mr. Steele, don't play dumb, it's not for you. Stanley Moore sent out a letter asking for a large sum of money for a DVD that was meant for Mrs. Worth to see him on, or Stanley would have made it public. Samuel laughed. I don't see why Mr. Worth would want to spend money on keeping what is known to be a secret. Now it was my turn to raise an eyebrow. Mrs. Worth's DVDs, not the DVDs themselves, were widely known antiques. Everyone already knew about her lifestyle. Everyone. He nodded. I'd heard people mention her at some of Mr. Worth's parties. How did they react to Mrs. Worth's antics? Some of the men wanted to come next. Some wanted to know why Mr. Worth put up with her. He laughed again. Most of the women referred to her in derogatory terms. Of course, none of their thoughts were ever expressed to Mr. or Mrs. Worth in person. I find that hard to believe. Well, you got me there, he responded with a slight smile. Millie and I worked for Mr. Worth before Miss Susan came. His first wife, Miss Rebecca, was a very nice person, and we all liked her very much. Mr. Worth was very confused for a while after she passed away, and we were happy for him as he seemed to regain his senses. But now we were here before she came, and we will be here even if she leaves. Just as I was talking to Samuel, I suddenly remembered something that was bothering me as I was reading the staff profile. RJ was the friend who came to see me. Ralph James drove the car. Where could the driver be now? Thank you, Samuel, you're a shrewd fellow. I turned towards the garage. I remembered seeing Ralph's picture in the employee file. The picture matched Mrs. Foley's description. I introduced myself to Ralph. I'm doing a security check for Mr. Worth. Yes, I heard you would be around. I'm Ralph James. Nice car, I said, pointing to the Bentley. It's a Continental GTV8. Ralph, do you drive it often? Do you know Stanley? I noticed his gaze, but not really, only that he was in charge of pool maintenance before he was fired. Why would he be attending a safety inspection? So you haven't seen him since he was fired? Ralph paused for a moment, looked around to make sure it was just the two of us, and then answered, Stan got caught screwing Mrs. Voss, and as far as I know, her husband either caught them or knew about it and sent the kid away. Ralph grunted and continued, not only did Mr. WTH fire Stanley, but he notified all his rich friends that he had to do it. I'm sure he told them what Stanley took, and anyway, Stanley can't get work from rich people now, and regular people can't afford to pay enough to finance his acting career, and Stanley ran away, or he wasn't there, and as far as I can tell, and for someone who isn't a friend of Moore's, you know a lot of what happened to him after he was fired, and I'm talking about gossip, just gossip, and the family is the biggest rumor monger in the world. Maker, she's as hot as any woman I've ever met, but I like my job and don't want to end up like Stanley. Did she ever seduce you? No, but I noticed her looking at you. No, Ralph is a little jittery. Why is the security consultant so interested in what happened? I gave Ralph what I thought was a charming smile and went on. I was just trying to determine that Stanley Moore might be dangerous. Thanks to your help, you did a great job on the Bentley. I walked away realizing that Ralph had lied about his friendship with Stanley, even though he had said, I would like to get back to Samuel. If anyone knows anything, he must know. Hey Samuel, can I talk to you again? I asked him as I approached the kitchen. He gave me a small smile and nodded before following me out. Did you know about Mr. Worth sending someone to the Stanley's house? He asked me. It was the first I had heard of it. Samuel thought for a moment. If Mr. Worth had done that to get the DVD you described, maybe he would have roughed up the boy a little bit, you know, because the girl tried to blackmail Mr. Worth. Thanks. Is Mr. Samuel back yet? Samuel nodded and I started to look for my boss. I found him in the sitting room sipping on another whiskey, and when I walked in he nodded and raised his glass offering me a drink. I shook my head and sat down with him at his desk. He handed me another printed piece of paper that said Worth would be contacted on Saturday morning and told where to take the money. Stanley Moore's signature appeared on the printout again. Did you send 2 men to Moore's apartment? I shook my head. It wasn't the smartest move you could have made. What happens now? Mr. Worth seemed to slump in his chair. I will continue to look for him and hopefully find him by the end of the week. I have a serious suspicion that Stanley is the blackmailer, and from what I know of the young man, I don't think he is competent enough to come up with this DVD scheme. I didn't tell Worth about my suspicions. I'll see you tonight. I said that and went home to see if I really did have a clean pair of pants. Jason and Susan Worth were shocked that I was, shocked and a little pleased at how cleanly dressed I was. My tie was loosely tied around my neck and it was a dark brown knit. My slacks were dark brown with a sharp crease you could cut paper with, and I was still wearing my cowboy boots. So sue me, I like boots, but these were formal boots, good for dancing but not for work. My aren't they? Susan greeted me as she spoke, holding a large glass which appeared to be filled with martinis and olives. Good evening, Mrs. WTH, Mr. WTH, who had just joined us at the entrance to the grand ballroom, not Susan's first of the evening. The dark green, low-cut, flowing gown she wore matched her hair color, which was worn in some sort of hairstyle that showed off her sexy neck and shoulders. Satan stepped up behind me, and I said to myself, this isn't the first time, let me show you around. Susan motioned for me to show you around. Mr. Worth walked in and took my arm. I'll go check on Mr. Steele. Honey, go check on the other guests, you're no fun. I nodded to her and let WTH lead me towards the bar. He gave 2 fingers to the bartender and in no time at all we all had a large gentleman's drink. Jack Samuel was right. It's good to be a king. Danby was the tall blonde by the fireplace. Summers told me that Danby looked like the idol Richie. He was tanned and looked fit. I guess women find him handsome. He reminds me of some of the men I saw when I spent summers in Texas with my grandfather. Mr. Worth, it's not him, and he's not a threat to your marriage. How can you be sure of that, Mr. Steele? You've never met or spoken to him. Susan, I mean Mrs. Worth, I'm sure she's just playing on your nostalgia for Danby. Susan was talking to 2 other women, so I pointing to where she was, and I added that she hadn't been near him, hadn't even looked at him. He's been here several times in the last 2 weeks, sometimes when I'm in the office. Worth explained that every time I've been with them, and I believe that the word is flirting, you know, she's saying all kinds of one-liners and giving him sexy looks. Mr. Worth, your wife can give you sexy expressions brushing her teeth, and I already said it. She's not a sexy woman. I'm not a marriage counselor or anything. This is just my opinion. So you don't think Susan's having an affair with Den Summers, do you? Why would she do that? I mean, it's so blatant. It's Worth seeming really upset that this isn't the guy who walks into my office and pretends that the whole world is his. Maybe she thinks you don't pay enough attention to her, that you spend too much time at the office. Maybe she's upset because you forgot her birthday or her anniversary. Maybe she's just a jerk. You're asking the wrong person. Mr. Voss, I suggest you ask your wife Susan. Take a chance and get over here. Grab my arm. Come on, Mr. Steele, let me show you around. I'm not here to socialize, Mrs. Worth. I'm working, but if you don't want people to know who you are, you should act like any other guest, don't you think? Susan looked at me with challenging eyes. Her eyes silently warned me that if I didn't, she would tell everyone why I was here at this cocktail party. Go ahead, Mr. Stephen Worth. Susan's advice was right. I don't want everyone to know that I've hired a detective to defend our reputation. There's a lot of Brad Chad in this crowd, and of course Danby. There's no John Bob or Jim. There's a lot of Tiffy and Heather, but there's no Mary Sally or Jane for Daphne, and there's a lot of faux intellectuals, trust fund babies and wannabes in this crowd. With a humorous smile, she said, I was badly hurt, but I made it through. I explained that hello, my name is Matthew Steele, and that I wanted to know more about this woman, and that I hadn't promised to stay away from her yet, and she asked me if I needed any more introductions. Abigail, who had freckles on her nose, asked me if I had passed the test, to which I brilliantly replied, when I make up my mind I turn into a devil with a silver tongue, and you're staring at me, so I want to know if I've passed your test. Miss Stewart, I'm sure you'd pass anybody's exam, you know, please call me Abby, I haven't seen you here before, who are you but Matt? I know you're a private detective investigating an extortion scheme against Jason. I said, how do you know I'm trying to cover my tracks? You can't keep a secret from domestic staff. They have better information than the CIA. She laughed again. Besides, Jacqueline and I are good friends. I know her from school. She laughed again. Besides, Jacqueline and I were good friends. I knew her from school. My face must have crumpled slightly. Maybe Abby noticed the disappointment in my eyes. I've never had a decent poker face when it comes to women. Why that expression? She asked. I shook my head again. I sighed and replied, if you must know, I had hoped to get to know you a little better, maybe see a movie, or have dinner together, but if you and Jacqueline were classmates, I hesitated, trying to come up with a way to explain my thoughts without making myself look stupid. I teach English literature at Forest Park Community College. Jacqueline has taken a few of my classes and we've become friends, though I run the risk of speaking out of turn, or gosh, how old are you anyway, Abby? A lady never likes to reveal her age. She smiles, but I'm going to make an exception this time. I'll be 32 next month, and a grin spreads across my face. Well, if I could satisfy her curiosity, I wouldn't be robbing the cradle. I thought, would you like to join me on the patio for a drink as soon as I take my foot out of my mouth? I discovered that she loved the outdoors, especially fishing, canoeing and camping. Nearly an hour later, I asked the question I should have asked at the beginning of the conversation, who do you belong to? I moved closer to Abby and kissed her right away. It's just a deposit. The full amount will come later, and there will be penalties if you pay late, she said as she stood up. We better get back to the house before Jason sends out a search party. Is he that concerned about you? I ask you, and don't tell me that you've run away with Worth, like Susan and Herman. My father and he were good friends in college, and have worked together in many business ventures since then. Dad was Uncle Jason and his first wife's wedding. My father died last year, but if he'd been there he might have stopped Uncle Jason and Susan's marriage. I tried, but yes, the heart wants what the heart wants. Logic and common sense don't work in this case, I said when we got back to the house. My Matt, you have the heart of a poet. Abby laughed. And I don't know if she's making fun of me. I don't know if she's making fun of me. No, I'm just read that somewhere and it seemed to fit Jason's situation, who came hurrying toward us. As we stepped through the French doors into the house, Abby replied that I don't need anyone to protect me and no one has ever been able to coerce me into doing something I don't want to do. Well, she spoke up. If you need to protect someone, I suggest you protect Susan. I shrugged and said to myself, can't you keep your mouth shut? If you'd like, Mr. Steele, we can delve further into our alternatives. I nodded and turned to Abby. I'll call you when I'm done. I turned to the party for another half hour and then left. After driving all the limos and sports cars and bringing my truck to me, the valet didn't seem too happy, but he became much happier when I tipped him $10, and the next morning Samuel let me in and showed me to the very large kitchen. I thought Mr. Worth would be dining in the dining room. I told Samuel that he would. Mrs. Worth didn't dine with him much, except for dinner, and now and then there would be a seating area. Worth greeted me. Millie, could you get Mr. Steele some coffee and breakfast? Just coffee would be fine. Millie, thank you. I seldom eat breakfast. Mr. Worth slowed me down. Whatever. I think he looks different today, more relaxed, not as tense as I usually am. I watched Susan and Dan closely last night and Worth made the point that he wanted to put his arm around Susan or hold her hand, but she slapped him away every time and finally she told him to stay away from her or she would kick him out. You're right, nothing happened. Good coffee, Millie. Like I said before, Mr. Worth, I'm sure she's just messing with you. How do you know so much about people? If you want to be a competent detective, you have to be able to read people's facial expressions, body language and tone of voice. Susan replied, see you at dinner, Jason, bye. Susan sprinted to a bright red Mercedes SL 550 convertible. I watched her from the window as she shoved her travel bag into the passenger seat, hopped in, hit the rubber pedals, and headed down the long winding driveway that sold for about $100,000. My cell phone rang. "I'm sorry," I said and answered the phone. "Mr. Steele, I'm Irma Foley. I'm the one you said was Stanley's." "Yes, I remember you. Mrs. Foley, Stanley is in his apartment right now. He says he's moving to California to live with some friends." "Thank you, Mrs. Foley. I'll be right there in 30 minutes. I don't want to cause you any trouble, but I may need your help. Mr. Steele, I don't believe that you're interested in a job interview the old woman sent me. Why do you want to see Stanley?" "I assure you, Mrs. Foley, if Stanley is innocent, I believe I'll help him, and if he's guilty, I'll see that he goes to jail." After a few seconds, Mrs. Foley answered, "I believe I can trust you. Mr. Stanley said his friend would be here at 4. I hung up the phone and looked at my watch. I had 40 minutes to get to Stanley's house, and I thought I'd have a short talk with him. I pressed the button for Mrs. Foley's apartment. She poked her head out of the window and recognized me and told me to come in. Stanley was still in his apartment. She said I hadn't informed him you were coming. I listened at the door for a few seconds and then tried the doorknob. The door was unlocked, so I quickly pushed it open. Moore looked up with a worried look on his face. He picked up a large table lamp and swung it at me like a club. "Stanley told his son to get the hell out of my apartment." I moved the Cardinals jacket aside and flashed my Glock. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk to you. Did Worth contact you?" He asked. "Yes, but I'm not like the other two," he explained. "I'm not here to rough you up." He seemed skeptical, so I added, "Put the lamp down and let's talk." Stanley looked like he was going to go to Sprint after all, so I closed the door and leaned against it. "I am a private investigator hired to find you. You are accused of blackmailing. A DVD about you and Miss Vir. I know nothing about blackmail letters or DVDs. The first I heard of them was when 2 of Mr. W's men came to see me. Mrs. Susan Worth and I finally crossed paths, but I didn't record it." "Where did you and Mrs. Worth usually meet?" "When they turned to look at me, I got out of the back seat and went to see my sister in Baldwin. Today was my first day back, and Mr. Worth wrote me 2 letters asking for money." It's not me. I just want to go to California. Mr. Worth is making it hard for me to get work here, so I'm going. I just want to get out of St. Louis. There's a lot of swimming pools to maintain in California, and a lot of acting chances. I believe in you, Stanley." And looking at this young man, "I can see who sent the letters. What do you want me to do?" His voice was tired and frightened. "You'll have to play a part, Stanley, but I've heard you're quite a good actor." The young man did smile, pleased to be praised for his acting. "I mean, you can take me to Mr. Worth's, take the money and go. Mr. Worth hired me to solve a problem for him, and I took the job, so I'll do my best, and I guess you could say it's a matter of pride in my work or something." I told him what I wanted him to do, and Stanley shook his head at first, but when I explained his position the next day, he eased up, and he finally smiled weakly at me, and I could see the wheels spinning. "Stanley doesn't even consider running away. If you do, Mr. W will send more men after you, including me. You can't hide from me here. You can't hide from me in a Hollywood setting, and you sure as hell don't want to see me angry." I gave him what I thought was a stern look. "And you sure don't want to see me angry. That's my friend Jimmy, he's an actor too. We're going to California together." Stanley answered my whispered question and I answered, welcoming Jimmy into the house. Jimmy was about 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed close to 3,100 pounds, with no belly fat, broad shoulders, a tapering chest, and a waist slightly larger than mine. He wore shorts that showed off his trunk and legs and a top that showed off his stomach. Jimmy had 12-pack abs instead of 6-pack. "I thought Stanley wanted to ask you a favor, Jimmy. I was hoping you could give him a hand." "Cool," Jimmy said as he walked over to the fridge and grabbed a beer and sat his ass down on the couch. "Stan, what are you having?" I parked in the driveway on the side of the road and walked to the back of the house and found Emily in the kitchen. Mrs. Ripley was there. Samuel was there. I wanted to talk to him. "Please call me Millie. Everyone calls me Millie." Samuel was in the garage. It was like a broken pipe or something. He listened for a few seconds. "Did I say I was looking for Mr. Jason Boss?" Samuel listened again and smiled. "Thank you. Have your men meet me at the back of the house." He smiled and looked over to where I was waiting. "Mr. Worth is a bit of a monarch around here. It's great to be king if you need something done right away. You remind me of a former Marine gunnery sergeant major." I grinned at Samuel and said that nothing gets done around here without you. Samuel said, "You can put the soft soap away, Mr. Steele. What do you need?" Samuel grabbed a key ring from his undershirt and gestured for me to go upstairs with him to the second floor of the garage. Samuel unlocked the door and stood aside to let me in. He said I'd wait for you downstairs and then started to walk away. "I'd rather you stayed. If anything happens to me, I want to see it with my own eyes. I don't want anyone to think I planted anything to earn a fee." I was thinking about how beautiful the apartment was, almost as much space as the garage, a large 40 by 30 room with a living room, a sleeping area and a kitchen with a large table between the kitchen and the living room. I glanced around the apartment and surveyed my surroundings before stopping at a large bookcase against the wall next to the bed. Ralph didn't strike me as a book lover. I turned to Samuel and inquired, "Do you believe that Ralph has read all of these books?" I approached the bookcase and began to scrutinize the books. 2 books seemed to be different from the others and I attempted to take them off the shelf. The 2 volumes were actually one book and both were held in my hands. I examined it and found that it had recorded 2 discs, a disc suitable for DVDs, which was pretty much what I expected. I was mostly talking to myself. Samuel joined me at the bookshelf, and when Stanley's neighbor described the men who had recently visited him, I began to suspect that Ralph, who I believe sent the letter with Stanley's name typed on it, which is pretty much a testament to the fact that now that you know what you are going to do, Samuel asked, and the look on his face told me what he was going to do. I had a little plan. Seeing the look on Samuel's face, I immediately added that breaking his neck was not part of my plan. I explained my plan, and that's why I had this little cutie with me. Not only does my device record, but it also transmits the recordings to my laptop so I can watch everything in real time and record it as a backup. Plus Stanley is wearing a wire, so if all goes well, we'll be done by dinner. 2 hours later, Ralph returned in the Bentley, which would be parked in its own designated area of the garage. Ralph noticed me leaning against the fender of my beat-up but trustworthy truck. He sneered and said, "You should think about upgrading your ride. In your field of work, one should promote his success. I can't afford something like that," I replied, pointing to the Bentley. "I have a friend at the dealership. Ralph told me he can get you a very cheap car." Ralph took out his wallet and asked me to give you his card and tell him I've sent someone. He was looking for his card when Jimmy drove up with Stanley. He got out of the car and Jimmy followed. They came towards me and I brought my friend back. Stanley spoke a little haughtily. "You know, in case there was any difficulty." "Well, Stanley, I'll explain. I'm going to go and get Mr. Worth." Ralph puts his hand on Stanley's shoulder, then removes it at Jimmy's grunt. "What are you doing here, Stan? I thought you'd be gone by now." "I was just about to leave, but I didn't want my reputation to be dragged down, so I've come to call on Mr. WTH." Stanley's voice sounds very concerned and serious. He gestures to Samuel, who's exchanging pleasantries with the plumber. Stanley follows Ralph up the stairs into the apartment. Ralph looked around to see if anyone had spotted them and closed the door. "I understand that I could go to jail, but I haven't done anything wrong, except for sleeping with Mrs. Worth. Thank you for all your help over the last few weeks, but I can't leave my name in the sludge." Stanley said. "What are you going to do about it?" Ralph asked. "I'm going to give this to Mr. Worth," Stanley replied, and took a DVD out of his jacket. Ralph asked, seeming to be in disbelief of his doom. "Listen, Stanley, it's me. Sent the letter to Worth. I mean, he's got more money than he can use. Why shouldn't we get a piece of it?" Stanley shook his head. "According to the script, I don't want to be thought of as a blackmailer. Do you care what a bunch of rich people in Missouri think of you?" I was watching and listening to the chat on my laptop. It was cool. I think I've got nothing to do but outsmart him. I heard Ralph admit it and decided that was all I needed. The man I was talking to was Detective Frank Wins of the St. Louis Police Department. He worked with me before I was forced to leave the department. In fact, he was my drill sergeant. Frank was now the chief detective of his precinct. A police car pulled up next to my truck. Frank followed in his unmarked car. Frank got out of his car and sauntered over to my truck. I pointed to the steps leading up to Ralph's steps. "Matt, don't you want to check it out?" Frank inquired while signaling 2 patrolmen towards the stairs. He didn't like arresting people anymore. "Frank," I said, "both sides. This guy is too slick. I'm afraid to get my hands dirty, but it's okay for me and my guys to get our hands dirty." Frank said he was pretending to be angry. "That's why they pay you the big bucks." Frank took his guys to the apartment. Soon 3 cops returned with a handcuffed Ralph. "You don't have anything on me." Ralph said, "This is me against Stanley," and I held up my laptop. "We've got you on tape. The colors are vibrant. The sound is stereo. Maybe not stereo, but we've got you on tape, man. That recording was made at my place and you can't use it in court without my permission." Ralph said smugly, "If this is really your place, then you're right. But this is Mr. Worth's place and I have his legal authorization to bug the garage and apartment. I don't believe he gave you permission." "I'll see you again," Ralph threatened. His face reddened with anger as he tried to walk toward me. He wanted to give me some time. "Okay, Frank," he nodded, and I took Ralph 2 or 3 paces away from the police. Frank and the 2 policemen were intently watching the cloud pattern and the neatly mowed lawn, trying not to notice Ralph and me. "You might see me," I told him, as I stared into his eyes, "that this was going to be a terrible career decision for you, and I didn't think you'd like the results if we ever met again." I hadn't touched the man. I hadn't even raised my voice to him, but the way I looked at him left no doubt as to what I would do if we met again. I sent him back to Frank and turned to Stanley. "Well done, Stanley. I commend the young man. I think you'll make it in Hollywood as an actor." Stanley smiled. "Thank you for clearing up Mr. Steele's name for me." He looked towards the house and saw Worth coming towards us. "Tell Mr. Worth I'm sorry about Susan. Will you go with Jimmy and let's get out of this shithole?" And give me a call me Stanley and tell me where you are, we may need you to testify. Frank nodded his thanks and put Ralph in handcuffs in the back of the police car. I handed him my laptop. I'd like to get it back after you guys pick up the recording, and I promise I'll get it back to you. Matt. Frank drove off after he told me that Worth was approaching me and asked me who those guys were. He turned to me and gave me a weak smile, and as much as I wanted to punch him out, he did say he was sorry to tell you. He claimed he couldn't help himself when Susan made a pass at him. But why didn't you stay with her? She obviously volunteered. Mr. Voss, you said you knew about my ex-wife and that I couldn't do that to another man after what was done to me. I said it was none of my business, but did you make a choice about Susan? Worth replied that he was part of Mr. Steele's plan to catch Ralph, the real blackmailer, and if you hurry you can catch up with him, so why should I go with that young thug? But you can't stay here, you don't live here anymore. But Jason. Susan leaned over him and said, I don't want it. It's whatever you want, Susan. You can have your car and your clothes. You can even have your jewelry. You have an hour to pack up and leave. Worth nodded and headed for the garage. You signed a prenuptial agreement, but I've already set it up for you. You get $50,000. I shrugged and held out my palm as if to say, what are you going to do? Susan started to trot towards the garage, but worse, the Bentley screeched out the garage door and down the driveway, the loud engine sound echoing down the driveway for a long time. I suggest you hurry up and pack your bags. I think Samuel will have you out in an hour. Samuel stood in the middle of the house and garage with a contented smile on his face, Millie and Jakin next to him. The last I saw of Mrs. Worth was her lovely back as she ran towards the house, and after grabbing my camera, I got into my truck and left the Worth estate. I asked Abby, who I had called the day after I had solved Worth's little problem, that I liked Italian food but I didn't know of a good place to go. She replied, don't worry, I know the best place in town. Pick you up at 7 p.m. Abby lived in an old brick house across the street from Lafayette Park. I walked up to her door and rang the bell. I almost fainted when she answered me. Abby looked very pretty in a popular little black dress, except this one was sunflower yellow. She looked around and smiled as she asked where my rusty old truck was. I had heard Uncle Jason describe it as the ugliest thing he had ever seen, and he didn't like my car. I wondered how anyone could not like my reliable truck. I refurbished the Corvette and painted it Riverside Red, one of its original colors. Abby's face instantly turned red and she even giggled. I opened the door and helped Abby into the car, and as we left I revved the engine a little to show off where we were going before everyone became so politically correct. This used to be known as the Hill, and many Italians settled here. If you want to taste good Italian food, the Hill is the place to go. I'm surprised you don't know about the Hill. My life has been relatively closed since I moved to St. Louis as a teenager. I pulled into the parking lot next to the restaurant and Abby curiously surveyed the neighborhood and the building next to it, home to Gatsby's, the best Italian restaurant in the city. I told her that not only was the food delicious, but it felt like dining in someone's home, and you'll notice I opened the door and we walked in. Hello and welcome. He walks to his left and says, hey, there's a lovely young couple in front of the house, can you take care of them? Abby seemed surprised and I smiled and asked, are they casual? Let's sit at the table and see what happens. I recommended that he greet us, bring us menus, and order us drinks. I looked around the spacious room and spotted a table in the back corner. I spotted 3 men I recognized who reappeared with large beers, and we ordered dinner. While you were waiting for your order, Sal asked me if there was anything else. Did you see those 3 guys back there? Sal turned his head and asked, where are those guys? I nodded, then added, a round of drinks for them, please, on me. Sal shuffled over to the bar, then brought 3 fish balls to the table. He gestured to me and the big guy raised his glass in thanks and took a big drink. Abby asked if Frank was the one on the left, who won. Rory Chambers was in the center, and Tully was the big guy on the right. I nodded to him. Ralph, you're out on bail, no thank you. I stood up and faced him. The look in my eyes and the tone of my voice made him give up on what he wanted to say. Or about Abby, let's skip all the insults and threats and get right to it, but I suggested that we go outside so we wouldn't interrupt anyone's dinner. Ralph took a step back, nodded and walked out. You stay here, Abby. I'll be right back. I turned towards the door. Ralph was gone. I knew I had to deal with this right away, but I knew that if I continued to lay down I could be seriously injured or I could never get up. It was up to Ralph, and I don't think he cared too much about how I felt. I stood up and faced Ralph. He had 2 co-workers with him. One of them had a short 2x4 that he used to hit me with. I know you don't have any friends that will help you, Ralph. How much are these guys going to cost you? Don't think about guns, we have guns too. His 2 associates pulled their jackets open. One of them had a pistol stuck to his shoulder and the other had a gun stuck to his waist. If this had happened 150 years ago, my draw would have made me the fastest gunman in the West. Now, boys, with your left hand, draw your pistols with 2 fingers and throw them in front of me. I believe the boy has a point, replied Tully, holding his Glock pistol by his leg. I didn't expect them to answer, it was just a rhetorical question, why don't you guys come with us? Frank said, letting Mr. James and Mr. Steele finish their conversation. I'm sure you've all done this before. Frank searched them quickly. I kicked the 2 pistols that were on the floor in front of me into the gutter to make sure my weapons were safe, and I holstered them. Ralph, is there anything you want to say to me? Lacking confidence compared to when he was Ed, he hesitated for a few seconds before picking up the 2x4 and charging at me. I moved inside the arc of his swing, my left hand grabbed his right hand forcefully and stopped his charge, a straight right to his stomach knocked him over, another straight left knocked him to the ground. Ralph was done. I knelt beside him. Ralph, pay attention. I don't want to talk to you about this anymore, do you understand? Ralph coughed and said in a shaky voice, I understand, good boy, I responded and stood up. He's all yours, Frank. Ralph James, you're under arrest for assault. He turned to the 2 wannabe defenders and yelled, get the hell out of here before I let Tully loose on you. He said that I would call a patrol car to take him to the precinct, and Frank explained that I hadn't finished dinner yet. I turned back to Rory and Tully and thanked them. They smiled and nodded. What do you see? Rory, who was standing behind Rory and Tully, said, you're the one who bought the booze. Abby was in the open doorway, her eyes were wide and she had a napkin in her hand. I thought to myself, why did this happen on our first date? I approached Abby and started to apologize. You really know how to entertain a girl, don't you? Abby smiled and replied, come on, our dinner is getting cold. She took my hand and led me back inside the restaurant. As he passed our table, Tully slowed down and leaned down and said, Matt, I'm sure you have a great candidate, don't screw it up. Abby heard that and said thank you softly. I nodded at Tully and then smiled at Abby. Tully, I'm sure you're right, I guess that's the next story. They met at Marcus Financial Group. She started as an administrative assistant and later became the administrative assistant to his employer, Jack Marcus. 7 months ago, Jack's grandfather founded the company, which is currently run by his father, Alan. Alan invited Jack to join the company after college to learn the ropes, and Jack was soon promoted to regional manager. They met during Mark's physical rehabilitation and Alan recognized his abilities and offered him a job immediately. 8 years ago, Mark had just completed his business degree and began working for Alan. He completed his therapy, earned an MBA, and fell in love with Allison when she joined the company. Alan confided in Mark his concerns about Jack's behavior. Alan said, you know, I'm going to have to make him a regional manager eventually, and I know I'm counting on you to set a good example and help Jack adjust to his new position. Mark didn't sugarcoat it. Alan insisted that he was too rambunctious, didn't listen to others, spent too much time flirting, went around proclaiming his reputation. Allison claimed that he was a physical abuse lawsuit waiting to happen. Mark said. Alan shook his head. I'm scared. His mother spoiled him. I'm hoping that this job will help him to mature. I'll have a talk with him. When's Bill retiring? Mark asks current regional manager Bill Collins if he wants to retire in the next 6 months. He bought a house in North Idaho to retire. Alan explains. Alan left with a vow to stay in touch. I have been thinking about hiring a new EA and I think Allison would be a good fit. He said it was my wife Allison. Mark inquired and said yes. Jake replied that Gretchen is retiring soon and we need fresh blood. First of all, what is she like at home? Jake smiled and asked. Mark doesn't like the direction the conversation is going. Allison and I are happily married. She is a professional. If you think she is up to it, offer her the job. It's her decision. Keep in mind that she is married to me. I get it. If she accepts the position she may need to travel. Do you agree with that? Jake asked. My wife is a person that I trust and I would like you to respect our marriage. Mark said forcefully. Of course, Mark, I respect you and your marriage, Jack replied, still snickering. You might even get a promotion that night. Mark said to Allison, did you talk to Jack today? Yes, he mentioned the position. She replied, what are your thoughts? Mark inquired. It would require traveling and staying up late. Allison said, are you worried about anything? Mark asked, I know there are rumors, but do you trust me? She asks, of course I believe you, but I don't believe him. Mark says, great, I think I can take the job. Allison decides that they go to bed and have sex before going to sleep. Allison accepts the position, traveling every 2 weeks and working 3 nights a week. Mark supports her and believes that she is not guilty of any unethical behavior. Alan passed away that night over 3 months ago from a severe stroke. The company was devastated and everyone went to his funeral. Jack had wanted to be CEO but the board appointed David Matt as interim CEO. Jack was considered inexperienced but was determined to prove himself. She became demanding and cranky. Mark confronted Allison on Sunday after returning from a trip to New York. Allison, We need to discuss what she said about us. Jack's schedule is taking our breath away. We need time away to reconnect. I'm so sorry. Jack's so busy. Things are crazy. Tell Jack you're going to take a week off. We need to take a break. The next day Allison came home happier. Jack agreed. Can we take the next week off if we go to his Friday night party? It's just a small gathering of friends. Mark felt uneasy but agreed on the condition that Allison come home early for the rest of the week. Do you know any of these people? I've met some of them. Allison admitted that most of his friends were from college. Mark said, okay, but please come home this week at your normal time to get home. I believe we have the Henderson account dinner party on Wednesday, but Mark understands that this is Aaron's first priority after his stroke. Well, it's Wednesday night, but I'll be home on time for the rest of the week. What can I do for Jack? When he walks into Mark's office the next afternoon, Mark asked Ally, will you be in Ally's office Friday night? Mark thought for a moment. Yes, as long as she gets home on time. The rest of the week we get the next week off. Mark didn't know what to say to that. I'm glad you're happy with her work, but there is one thing. Jack asked, do you address her directly as Ally? Allison asked, do you allow Jack to call you Ellie? You never stopped me. He is my boss. He can call me whatever he wants, she explained. Mark had given it up, but it bothered him. Everything went well this week, except Wednesday night. She got home on time. They often made love on Friday nights. Mark dressed casually and observed Allison getting ready. Her new dress was shorter and more revealing. She wore a pair of panties he had never seen before and no bra. The dress had slits on the sides that showed a lot of skin and the open back almost showed her panties. I bought them in New York and Jack told me to wear them tonight. Of course, be careful, some people might get the wrong idea. She laughed. I don't think so. Everyone understands their boundaries and they are better. As Jack opened the door, Mark smelled marijuana and he became nervous. 3 young lads were introduced to the Henderson employees, including John Whitehead, George Franklin, and Alan Jenkins. Guys, this is Mark Hurley, Jack replied with a grin. Mark, this is John, George, and Alan. Mark shook his hand and contemplated why Jack referred to him as a windbag, yet didn't introduce Allison. My God, Allie. Mark didn't like Jack's reaction. Let me get you guys some drinks. Ollie, white wine. Mark, that's okay. I don't drink much, Mark. I have a very high alcohol tolerance, but quit drinking years ago. Allison took a big sip, but Mark only took a small sip to stay awake. Jack led the group to the living room and Mark saw Allison sitting on the couch and Jack quickly sat down next to her. My father said you served in the Marines. Yes, for 5 years until you were discharged due to illness. Mark replied. JN asked, have you ever seen anyone killed in combat? No, I prefer to keep a clear head, Jack insisted. Mark, it's a party, go ahead. I'd rather be sober. You're a loss and, if you're too messed up, you can stay here. You'll be gone by next week anyway. He turned to face Allison's rifle. Allison grinned and nodded her head affirmatively. Jack blew the blue smoke into her mouth and she inhaled, choking slightly a little. That's amazing stuff, she said. Mark was taken aback. Not recognizing this side of her, Jack handed the cigarette back to George. Jack pointed to Mark, the company's top business analyst, who saved us millions of dollars and brought me this beautiful helper. I consider her my work wife. Jack said this while patting Allison's bare thighs. Mark thought he saw Jack's hand move under her skirt for a moment before retracting it. Mark locked the door and stared in the mirror, suspecting that Allison was cheating on Jack. He remembered Alan's comment about paying attention to details. Mark spotted some worrying signs: Allison's revealing attire, her interactions with Jack, her new birth control pills, and Jack referring to her as his work wife. Mark returned to the room and saw that Allison had hastily puffed some white powder on her nose, as had the others, and Mark took a sip of his drink and realized that there was some powder at the bottom of his glass, and he was suddenly fatigued and incoherent. Jack mumbled, and as they put their feet up, Allison took off his shoes, and Mark saw her undressing on the love seat, and Allison covered him with the Afghan's clothes. I'm sorry, Mark, I really love you, she murmured, kissing his forehead. He paused the video and tiptoed up to the master suite to find Allison lying naked on Jack's bed with one leg over him, one of the 3 men also lying naked beside her, and the other 2 sleeping, one on the couch and the other in the recliner. So he searched Jack's kitchen and found a Tupperware box, which he poured the liquid into and sealed it up, and returned to the front room. He removed Allison's keys from her keychain first and found an unknown key, which he put in his pocket, then picked up Allison's cell phone, intending to check it later. He closed the door behind him and carefully drove away, not turning on his headlights until he was out on the street. He drove to a convenience store and contacted his old friend, R.K. Evans, who ran a private investigation agency. Hello R.K., I'm sleeping. Hello Mark, it's Mark, I'm sorry to call you so late, but I need your help. What's up Mark? do you need bail money or something? He puts a beer in the fridge, lights a cigarette, sits on the couch, uses a candy dish as an ashtray. RK comes in, Mark buys him a beer. He describes the events of the night. Mark says it's sacred. When he's done, Mark hands him a jug of spiked wine. Can you analyze it? And Alan Jenkins works for Henderson Manufacturing. Here is their footage. I see. Mark said, do you want to spy on Jack's place from your place? Yes, if that's okay. I have a key. I didn't notice the security system. RK had the key. That's not a problem. How did you receive this? Mark said, how much did it cost? Don't worry about it. You saved my life in the Middle East. It's the least I can do. Thank you, old friend. Please let me pay for it. Okay, RK said. Let's take a look at the clues in the video. Mark started the video from the beginning. Stop there, RK said. Mark paused the video for a moment. They watched as the camera showed Allison smearing a line of white powder on the coffee table. Mark said, I noticed that. Mark says, I noticed that when she first sat up, the powder on the table looked like. Yes, Mark says, interesting. Have you ever seen Allison take a pill? As I went to the restroom, he continued to videotape, and they observed that when the drugs affected Mark, the camera showed him lying down and the others looking down at him. They heard Allison ask if he was okay. Jack told him to take a nap. Allison then bent down and whispered in his ear, are you sure you don't want to tie him up and make him watch us? George asked. No, Allison said. That's for one night. That's more than enough for one night. We have a whole week. We can always escalate the situation if he refuses to cooperate. Jack said. John is not pleasing either way. He smiled and said, maybe he could show Mark the other side. Mark's face turned red when he heard Allison join. And I want to see if she's telling the truth. Jan asked, you let me fuck your husband? Sure, why not? She said, maybe if you're likable you could make him do more. They all laugh again, and John says, I've never fucked a Marine before, but I doubt he'll be able to prepare as far in advance as you are. Mark resists the urge to throw his cell phone and says, seriously, Jack, he'll be fine. You didn't give him too much, did you? Allison asks. No, he'll be fine. Jack says he'll sleep for 12 hours and then wake up with a headache. He'll think he's had too much to drink tomorrow. I'll introduce him to the really hard stuff. Next week Mark will be a powder user. Maybe I'll even get him to work on the streets for me. It's too bad dear old dad isn't there to watch his golden boy fall. Is that why you hate him? Allison asks. That's all I ever heard in college. Jack says Mark is how he went to school and served and fought for America and how he worked hard while defending his country, and sometimes I think Dad would rather have Mark as a son than me. So guess what, Dad, I'm Mark's boss now and I've got Mark's woman, and next week your golden boy is going to be a powder user. And Allison said, I love this so much I can't walk away. And they think she's pointing to Jack's prick. Well, Jack said, let's go upstairs and get the real party started. Okay, Allison mumbled. Go upstairs and make me airtight. This time the video recorded the sounds of sex in the bedroom. Mark stopped the video and put his head in his hands. Mark put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We're going to get you through this, RK said. Mark nodded. Thanks, Mark. What are you going to do? But we need you to be safe. But I can help you, Mark insisted. RK shook his head. No, you're in danger. Remember Gunny Johnson. Okay, let me go ahead and hook up the audio and video in the room, Mark said. Stay focused. Got it? Yes, thank you, RK. You're a good friend, RK said with a smile. Simple guy. It's now or never. After RK left, Mark turned on his computer and accessed his bank account. He still kept a premarital account into which he had deposited 10% of his paycheck, originally to surprise Allison. His eyes fell on their wedding portrait above the fireplace. She betrayed me and I am filled with rage. He tore up the portrait with a hunting knife and threw all the pictures of Allison into the fireplace. He reminded the board of the ethics clause in Jack's employment agreement and the potential lawsuits and scandals that could result from his behavior. He expresses his respect for Ellen and wants the board to take appropriate action. He unlocked her cell phone with a passcode he set up for her and was outraged when he read her text messages. They had been together for at least 6 months, but in the last 3 months Allison began to publicly disrespect him. He found countless photographs of Jack stripped naked, Jack and Allison kissing and dancing at a nightclub, most likely in New York City. Allison appeared in explicit footage with a number of men, and 2 videos of Allison having sex with Jack and others. When he saw the sunrise, he knew Allison would wake up and realize he had left. He expected her to wake up in an hour or 2, so he grabbed his loaded rifle, locked the door, and lay down on the couch hoping to get some sleep. 0 a.m. I looked at the clock on Jack's bedside table and went to the bathroom to wash up, and by the time she came out Jack and the others were awake. Jack was in his robe and looking at her. Do you want to go downstairs and get some breakfast? Jack asked her if she wanted to go downstairs and get some breakfast. Jack asked her. Mark would probably want coffee when he woke up, she said, putting on her robe and going downstairs to make a pot of coffee. She went to the living room to wake Mark up, but he wasn't there. The Afghan had been tossed aside and his shoes were gone. She rushed to the bathroom to look around, but he wasn't there. She noticed the car had driven away and his ring was in her purse. Oh no, she rushed up the stairs out of breath. Jack stopped her in the bedroom. What's wrong? He's gone. What do you mean he's gone? Jack was already downstairs. I've lost my cell phone. Use the house phone. You don't understand. It's full of messages, photos, and videos you've sent. Don't worry, please bring them over. We'll take care of it. Call him now. Allison picked up the phone and hesitantly dialed Mark's cell phone number. Hello. Mark's answer sounded sleepy. Mark, honey, it's me. What the hell do you want? She thought he must be angry, but she didn't know how angry. Mark, honey, I'm worried because you weren't here when Igor got up. Are you okay? What do you care? Honey, I need you to pick me up from Jack's house. Can you do that? Please don't be mad. I love you. Yes, okay. Tell me another one. Mark, we need to talk about it. Damn it. Yes we do, and then pick me up at Jack's house and we can talk about it on the way home. Wrong answer. I'm not going to be there if you want to talk about it. Walker called an Uber. That's what happens in a divorce. I don't want a divorce. Can't we figure it out? I don't want to get lost and cuckolded. If you want to talk about it, come home. I know what you've been doing for the last 3 months. They're going to help me get a divorce. My God, Mark, I sincerely apologize. I never meant to hurt you. Shut up, Mark. I hung up the phone. She looked at Jack. Jack asked if he was there. I need to go there and talk to him. Okay, we'll take you there. Then she shook her head. No, he's got a weapon. He's threatening to wipe out everyone who shows up. I've never heard him so angry before. Jack paused before going to the study. He came back with a syringe. Here's the plan. Put it in your bag. Call a cab. We'll follow you to your destination. She asked. It's a unique combination of heroin and something that will put him in a coma. The effects are quick. It won't hurt him. Just stick with it. Call me when he wakes up. You got it? He handed her the syringe and she put it in her bag. Okay, she replied. Just make sure you don't hurt him. We'll do our best. Okay, kids. When the driver arrived, she left. Jack and his companion followed and parked a block away. They didn't notice the white van parked across the street. Mark explained what Mark asked. My friend Mark mentioned modern technology. A parabolic microphone picked up. Your wife is calling an Uber and her friends are behind them. They are planning to poison you and then kidnap you. Mark reminded. I'll text you as soon as they leave. As soon as she arrives, turn on the surveillance equipment. I'll be monitoring it. I'll be right down the street. I'll contact the police if necessary. Be ready. Okay, thanks, Mark. About half an hour after receiving the text, on mobile. Showtime. Mark mumbled that it was about 20 minutes until they arrived, so he hid the weapon where they couldn't find it. He hid the weapon where Allison couldn't find it, turned on the surveillance equipment in the kitchen, grabbed a Ziploc baggie of syringes and a piece of paper towel, and watched from the window as the Uber arrived and Allison nervously clutched her wallet leaving. Her eyes widened at the sight of the burning portrait and her bridal gown. You're ruining my wedding photos. Mark, why are you doing this? Tears streamed down her cheeks, but Mark was unaffected. I almost killed him, and once, I decided never to drink again, just like you chose to be Jack's. Which, oh God, Mark, what have I done? Tell me what happened to you. How long have you been planning to kill me and abuse me? Was this your idea or Jack's? She looked shocked. I never thought about it. Mark explains that it doesn't matter. What matters is that David and the board members now have the video. The police will have it. We're getting divorced, and if I get my way, you'll be locked up for a long time. He picks up the syringe and a tissue. Is this what you have for me? Do you know what this is? Inaccurate, he asks sarcastically. You are going to inject me without knowing what will happen. You are such a sick witch. Did Jack tell you to do this? She nods. Yes. So if Jack told you to stick a fire poker up your ass and you did it, you were going to inject me and then ask him to come and kidnap me, weren't you? Shame. Right. Mark watched as she finished the call and put it on speaker. Jack, it's me, ally. It's done. He's gone. Bye, girl. We'll be right there. Mark sat in the recliner and waited. He saw Jack and his 3 friends through the window. He pretended to be asleep. His eyes were slightly open. Jack walked in, looked at the mess and then approached Mark. You've done a great job, Jack told Ellison. Now we're going to put him into the trunk. Jack reaches for Mark. Mark opens his eyes and slaps him across the throat before Jack can react. Mark kicks him hard in the thigh. Jack fell to his knees gasping in pain as Mark crept up behind him, pulled out his hunting knife, grabbed Jack by the hair and held the knife to his throat. Mark started to hold the knife against Jack's throat as Jack cried out, "Officer, don't do this, put the knife down, the police are on their way, he deserves to die." Mark kneels in front of Jack and shouts, "Yes, he deserves to die, but not through your hands. If you kill him you will go to jail, let the authorities handle it. As a friend, please put the knife down, he will suffer the consequences of his actions." Mark stared at the Ark and felt Jack shaking with fear. He slowly withdrew the knife and stood up. Ark turned Jack over and zipped up binding his hands and instructed Allison to face down. He secured her hands and she watched as a picture of herself and Mark burned in the fireplace. Hot tears streamed down her face. Ark said, "Give me your cell phone. I will talk to the police before they get here. Mark handed the cell phone to him. As RK left, Jack turned to face Mark, his smile disappeared. Jack says, "It's not like that, Mark. He always thought that one day you would grow enough to fill his shoes. Would you really cut off my head?" Jack asked, "We'll never know, will we?" Mark replied, "But I assure you, wherever you go, you'll meet someone like me who won't hesitate if you come after me again." A police officer picked up the syringe and plastic bag on the couch and asked Mark, "Is this what they were going to use on you?" After the cops left, RK joined Mark on the couch and he pointed to the beer bottle and asked Mark, "Is there another one?" "Yes, I talked to Gunny. He'll take care of everything. If you want to stay in Vegas for a few days, here's his number. I might do that. I've got some things here to take care of first." Mark was given 2 cards, his phone number and contact information for Michelle Hawkins, his divorce attorney, who despises crooks, and would like to see you at 8 a.m. Monday. "Thank you for everything," Mark said. "The Simba Faye brothers, it's now or never," Mark said. "Ola," Mark responded. After they finished their beers, Ray stood up. "You need to go clean up. I'll come by later to pick up the surveillance equipment." Mark left and started cleaning the room later that afternoon. Mark received a David Matt Mark's phone call. "I got your email, watched the video as did the board. We agree with your letter." "Very good, thank you, David. I'll go to the county jail and deal with this directly." "What's the other thing?" Mark asked us. "We thought you should take a few days to decompress. Do you have somewhere to go?" "Thank you, David. One more thing, we all think you're the best person to take over Jack's job." Mark inquired about it. "Yes. We're impressed with the way you're running things. The board appreciates your efforts. The salary and other benefits are going to be increased. You deserve it." "Thank you, David. The auditors will report back to you and you will report back to me." "That sounds like a great idea. I hear Allison is in love with a couple of his clients." "God, it's all yours then. Have a safe trip. We'll see you next Monday." "See you then." Mark cleaned the house and mowed the lawn, then called Gunnar Johnson and the two chatted. They laughed. "I'll keep that in mind, Gunny," Mark replied. "See you Monday night." CMMC. RK, by the way, went to pick up some equipment for a quick update. Police investigated Jake's home and found tons of drugs, sex gadgets, DVDs, and other items. The next day, Mark put Allison's things in garbage bags and took them to the garage, where he planned to take them to a yard sale until he learned that she was going to jail. 0 a.m. She read his proofs and documents, taking notes as she went along, and she discussed California's divorce laws, pointing out that all property was usually divided equally, that they had no children, that he had owned the house prior to the marriage, and she said that, during the time that she was incarcerated, he would most likely not have to pay alimony, but that could change once she is released. Michelle assured him that I would make this as painless as possible, that I would prepare and serve her with the papers, and if she signed them, I would give them to the judge, and then there would be a 6-month waiting period. Mark agreed and gave her a retainer. Before he left the house, he went to the county jail and told Allison he was filing for divorce. Sitting at the door of the jail, he watched as she was brought out looking haggard in her orange prison uniform. They picked up their cell phones and began communicating through the plexiglass shield. "Hello, Allison." "Hello, Mark. I wanted to let you know I'm filing for divorce. I saw an attorney today and I thought you will," she said. "What time do you have your arraignment?" "Tomorrow morning." The prosecutor asked that you not be released on bail. "It's for the best. Now tell me honestly," she asked. "What happened to you?" She bowed her head in embarrassment. "Everything went well at first. Jack was like all the other executives. He thought his father set you up. It's ridiculous." Mark said that Alan wants Jack to be CEO one day. "I get it." She said that we were in New York for the weekend at a club where the clients danced and drank, and I know that I'm in bed with 2. I know I was in bed with 2 men and it felt good. Jack came in later and she paused for a second. "The next morning I felt guilty. Jack then showed me pictures and videos he had taken and threatened to show them to you if I didn't do what he told me to do. After that they found drugs at his house, which is not surprising. Did he ever get you to do coke?" She nodded. "Yes, along with drugs and other things." "How many clients did you sleep with?" She shrugged. "I'm not sure. Jack arranges everything whenever he travels." Mark looked at the footage and shook his head. "It looks like you enjoyed your date with me." She shook her head. "No, we're organizing a party for Friday, so you arranged everything in advance." Allison nodded. "Yes, I'm sorry, Mark, that's the first time you've ever mentioned that I agreed to anything. Will you forgive me?" He laughed. "Not only no, but absolutely not. You cheated on me with that imbecile of who knows how many, then you planned the pill incident and attacked me. You're crazy, and don't ask if we can be friends." "I understand you, Mark. I hope it was worth it. Goodbye, Allison." He hung up. As tears streamed down her face, he went home and packed his bags and went to Las Vegas. He caught up with Gunnar Johnson and reminisced over dinner. Gunnar Johnson showed him around, gave him some game advice, and then took him to his room. Inside, a pretty young brunette sat on the bed when they came in. She was Rose. "Mark, this is Candy," the Gunnar said. "She's going to be your tour guide here." "Gunny, that won't be necessary," Mark said. "Nonsense, kid. That's just what you need, after all your wife has put You through, relax, have fun, and remember, what happens here stays here. They laughed and said, I've got to go. You two have fun, Gunny said before he left. Mark turned to Candy and told me you are an escort. Corazon, not anymore. Candy said, thanks Gunny, I'm out of the woods, I'm clean, I went to school and have a decent job. If you want, I'll just go away and leave you alone. Mark said, he's right, I need company right now. You're a good woman, would you like to go out for a drink? A good woman, would you like to go out for a drink? Sounds good. She helped him forget his troubles. He woke up and saw her beside him. They took a shower together and got dressed. I have school today, but I can come see you tonight if you want. He went to the casino to take his chances as per Danny's instructions and won $300, with which he bought dinner and drinks and put on a show with Candy that night. Candy hated to see him go, but she understood him and she provided him with her phone number and email address in case he wanted to contact her again. He liked her but doubted it would lead to a real relationship. She was much younger than he was and she had a full life ahead of her. He also got confirmation from Michelle that Allison had been served with divorce papers, which according to Michelle, Allison signed right away and filed with the court 6 months later, and that he would be free of her forever. Auditors found that Jack had misused multiple client accounts and reported this to the SEC, and Jack was soon under federal indictment. She eventually told him that she had met someone at school and that they were serious, and he wasn't surprised and wished her all the best. Despite her defense attorney's attempts to dissuade him, claiming that he wasn't forced to do it, I want to do it, he told her attorney, and besides, in a few weeks she won't be my wife anymore. Mark and David sat in the courtroom and watched as Alice, Jack and 3 others were escorted into the courtroom, neither of them daring to look Mark in the eye. By now the trial had become a media circus. The judge set a date for sentencing and the 5 convicted co-conspirators were escorted out of the courtroom. Mark and David pushed their way through the crowd of journalists and walked out and put the cameras in their faces. About 10 days later the sentencing began. The judge was clearly upset with all 5 of them and practically threw the book at them. Jack's 3 companions received the smallest amount of punishment, but they were still at risk of 20 years in prison. Allison was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Allison was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, while Jack was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and he will also face federal charges from the SEC that will be resolved in federal court. Allison sobbed uncontrollably as she was escorted from the courtroom, while Jack bowed his head in shame as he was taken away. About 6 months later, he was found decapitated in his bathtub. A month after his sentencing, Mark was in his office working on some paperwork because he'd pissed off someone who didn't like his cocky attitude. The door opened, and Mark noticed a cute blonde walk into his office, her hair draped over her shoulders and wearing a skirt that was just above her knees. He shook her hand and asked her to sit down. Please call me Mark, would you like something to drink? Coffee, tea, coffee would be great. Black, please call me Kristen. Mark asked Marla to pour them each a cup of coffee and sat down. She smiled and shook her head and said, no, I'm his niece. I see. I'm surprised we haven't met before. I thought I knew everyone in the Allen family. He asked me what I could do for you, and all I wanted was to meet the men who killed my mute relative, and I don't think there was any love lost between you. My uncle told me a lot about you. I know you're a doctor. Are you an MD? Listen, Christine, I'd like to continue our conversation at dinner. Listen, Kristen, I'd like to continue our conversation over dinner, if you don't mind seeing me in public with a lowly MBA. She grinned, a twinkle in her eye. Being an MBA isn't lonely, and I'd love to see you in public with me. 00. She handed him a card with her phone number and address. Red Lobster, Red Lobster. Mark took the card she handed him and replied, I can pick you up at 6:30, if that's convenient, so I'll see you then. She was ashamed and worried about being accused. She said nothing and avoided Allen and his family as much as she could because of Jack's behavior. She also avoided relationships with men while attending college. She spent months in therapy. When Mark proposed to Kristen, she practically tackled him to the ground and kissed him. I think that's a yes. And when she finally let him catch his breath, Mark couldn't help but ask, no, of course that's a yes. Now take me to bed and ravish me properly. Yes ma'am, Mark explained as he carried his bride up the stairs. Yes, he was sure things were going well. Thank you for listening to today's story. Please like it if you enjoyed listening to it, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please write your thoughts on the story below. Take care.